Last time we spoke about the planning for Operation Barbarossa. In 1940, as Europe faced the aftermath of the swift German blitzkrieg, Stalin realized the imminent threat to the Soviet Union. Following the Winter War with Finland, he reconstructed the Red Army, appointing General Zhukov as Chief of the General Staff. General Zhukov's remarkable military background shaped his strategies for the upcoming conflict. However, despite receiving numerous warnings about the German invasion, Stalin hesitated, believing the alarms to be fabrications. As tensions escalated, the Soviet military was still underprepared, facing critical shortages of equipment and personnel. On the 22nd of June of 1941, the Germans would launch their attack, exploiting the Red Army's disorganization and lack of readiness. Stalin, desperate to fortify defenses, rushed military production but was starkly unprepared for the rapid devastation that ensued. This catastrophic failure would haunt the Soviet Union as they struggled to adapt and respond to the unexpected German onslaught in the early days of Operation Barbarossa. This episode is Prelude number 11, Hitler's Decision to Go to War. Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Eastern Front podcast week by week. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, I just released an episode covering Japan's government by assassination period. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. In the last episode, we examined how Hitler began World War II against Western Europe, and the planning behind Operation Barbarossa. Today, we're going to dive into Hitler's ultimate decision for war against the Soviet Union. In December of 1940, a pivotal moment in World War II unfolded when Adolf Hitler signed War Directive 21. Hitler's war directives were a sort of executive order that he signed and published as a means of putting his priorities into action by the regime's various mechanisms. Throughout the war, he would sign about 74 of them, the last ones devolving into little more than his ideological rants and attempts to intervene in the smallest of tactical decisions. You know, Hitler just sandbagging his own generals and such. The critical order called for the German army and the Air Force to begin preparations for a bold and aggressive invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler recognized that this operation would likely need to occur before Germany could conclusively defeat Britain, underscoring the urgency and precautiousness of the Nazi strategy. War Directive 21 provided a rough outline for the invasion, revealing Hitler's expansion ambitions. The planned advance was to stretch from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, encapsulating a massive swath of territory. The directive's strategic vision targeted the annihilation of the majority of the Red Army, alongside a crucial goal, capturing the strategic city of Leningrad. Interestingly, this initial draft revealed that any push towards Moscow was envisioned as a subsequent objective, but to be contemplated only after achieving the first goals of the campaign. Hitler's strategy highlighted an astonishing military undertaking. He stipulated that the German forces would not advance beyond a delineation he had in mind, spanning roughly from Arkhangelsk in the north to the Volga River in the south. This indicated a monumental task covering a staggering 2,000 kilometers from the starting point of the German forces. To put this in perspective, the German front was already quite vast, measuring about 1,400 kilometers wide. But by the end of the planned campaign, it was expected to expand over 2,100 kilometers. War Directive 21 proposed a campaign unparalleled in military history, setting the stage for what would be the most ambitious military operation ever executed. Ambitions aside, the planning for the invasion highlighted significant issues within the Wehrmacht from the very beginning. A critical source of tension was the stark contrast in strategic vision between Adolf Hitler and his generals at the Oberkommando des Heers, or the OKH. the German Army High Command. It was subordinate to the OKW, or the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. The OKW was the German military's unified military high command. Hitler rarely followed the chain of command and regularly consulted with the OKH staff without first talking to the OKW, and vice versa. Being somebody who suffers from the brutality of bureaucracy, as I essentially kind of work for the federal government of Canada, I won't go into details, I can assure you that this was a bold strategy. Yes, when departments don't talk to each other, it always goes very well. Now, at the helm was General Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff. Halder was a professional officer who had been selected to be the next chief of the Army General Staff after the resignation of his predecessor, General Ludwig Beck, over disagreements with Hitler concerning the latter's plan for Czechoslovakia. Although a loyal supporter of the Nazi regime, Halder firmly believed that Hitler was mistaken and misled in his approach to conquering the USSR. Hitler's strategy emphasized the destruction of the Red Army as the primary objective of the campaign, suggesting that this would pave the way for subsequent seizures of vital industry and agricultural centers in Ukraine. He prioritized swift and decisive action aimed at neutralizing Soviet military capability, viewing it as essential for the favorable outcome. Now, in contrast, Halder advocated for focusing efforts on capturing Moscow first, arguing that securing the Soviet capital would destabilize the Soviet government and lead to a quicker resolution of the conflict. He believed that after taking Moscow, the Wehrmacht could negotiate for the economic and industrial resources necessary for a prolonged war in the West. This fundamental difference in perspective reflected not only the tactical considerations, but also divergent visions for the overall campaign in the East. These conflicting strategies created a hazardous environment where, although Hitler ordered one campaign plan to be developed and prepared, Halder and his subordinates only committed half-heartedly to fulfilling Hitler's directives. Instead, they began laying the groundwork to implement their strategy, banking on the idea that initial victories in the campaign would provide an opportunity to persuade Hitler of the merits of their plan. They believed that demonstrating success on the battlefield could sway the Führer to adopt their approach, thereby enabling a more focused and effective strategy in the East. Beyond strategic disagreements, the Wehrmacht faced several fundamental issues that severely impacted its campaign in the East. A critical challenge was the sorry state of the equipment standardization, which affected everything from the readiness of fighting units to the intricacies of logistical planning. During the build-up for the operations, General Halder's staff discovered that the Heer, aka the German Army, was equipped with no fewer than 150 different models of trucks, each produced by various German manufacturers. This hodgepodge of vehicles created significant logistical headaches. Many of the trucks used to transport supplies and maintain mobility for the panzer and motorized forces were actually civilian models that had been requisitioned during previous campaigns in Poland and France. This diverse assortment of vehicles meant that it was impossible to establish a comprehensive inventory of spare parts, which had dire implications for maintenance and the longevity of the trucks. As the units faced the harsh conditions of about 1,200 kilometers going to Moscow, the reliability of their transportation would inevitably suffer. Now, many of you might gloss over what essentially amounts to quite a logistical issue. However, logistics, honestly, is what defeated the Axis during World War II. No member of the Axis held significant oil, excluding, of course, Romania, who was basically dishing out all of her oil to, well, mostly Germany. But certainly enough Romania's oil was not enough. On top of that, Germany had a beautiful way of making automobile vehicles, but it was glaringly idiotic. To overly simplify, the Ford assembly line, the model created by Henry Ford, had workers creating all the different parts that made up a car over an assembly line. Each worker or worker teams made separate parts that they would specialize in, and these parts would be placed together at the end, basically to make up the car. Again, it's not really like that. I'm just simplifying this for kind of an allegory. But for Germany, it was kind of done in the opposite way. You see, the German workers would build up their vehicles, or panzers for that matter, from start to finish. Every single part made by the same people, providing excellent craftsmen to be sure, but it was unbelievably inefficient compared to that of the Americans or the British. You have to imagine the logistics behind this. Every single German engineer has to know how to make that model from start to finish. Whereas on an American assembly line, the men are just specializing in specific parts, putting them together at the end and making basically about 20 tanks by the time it took the Germans to make one. The Germans would be dishing out panzers at a very pathetic rate compared to all of their enemies, and worse yet, all of the German manufacturing companies did not standardize their parts. This meant there was an ungodly amount of different parts for all of their vehicles, requiring specialization for repair teams and a ton of reserve parts that all needed to be brought to the front lines. In a very strict comparison, early on in the war, America and Britain decided to use the exact same parts for all of their models, and they actually shared a lot of their blueprints. This meant all the Allied repair teams used standardized parts. It was much easier to train repair teams. They knew how to repair all the vehicles, and all the vehicles could basically use the same parts. The Allies were out-producing, out-repairing the Axis like no tomorrow. And this would prove to be a very decisive factor in the North African campaign, which me and my co-host Garav over at Echoes of War, we did a 10-episode series on, so why don't you go check it out. And yes, we really like logistics. We spent a lot of time talking about it. Now, on top of all of that, the German economy did not even become a full wartime economy until like 1944, when Albert Speer had to take over, and honestly, the story about that is kind of comical. He really freaked out when he found out what was going on. He found out German manufacturers were literally stealing resources from each other, all scrambling for things like steel. Sometimes they would even sabotage another and outright refuse to cooperate on anything, like, for example, they wouldn't even share their designs. So while many of the tank bros get wet in their pants about the glory of the Tiger I, for example, in the end, about 3 beat-up Shermans would take those down, or, a few T-34s, at the fraction of the cost, by the way. So, needless to say, Das Auto, not so much. But again, the Germans made fantastic tanks. They were beautiful. But, it's ridiculous. Actually, I can give you a really funny example off the top of my head, too. The Germans were so meticulous, they actually wouldn't let their tanks, by the end of the war, mind you, I'm talking 1944, leave their assembly lines if they weren't painted. And the paint job was very complicated and rather expensive. Meanwhile, what did the Allies do? They just used the cheapest green, lackluster paint, made it a very quick process, toss them out, and the Soviets, sometimes they didn't even paint their T-34s, they just tossed those bad boys out naked. But I desist from the story of German manufacturing in World War II. By May of 1940, the 10 panzer divisions each averaged about 256 tanks. However, by June of 1941, the number of panzer divisions had increased to 20, but their average strength had diluted to just 190 tanks per division. More importantly, the strongest panzer divisions in 1940 were the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Panzers, each boasting around 300 tanks. In contrast, by 1941, the most powerful divisions shifted to the 6th, 7th, and 20th Panzers, with only one of them exceeding 250 tanks. This dilution of the Wehrmacht's critical armor capability was deemed necessary to provide broader coverage across the vast front envisioned for Operation Barbarossa. While the strategy allowed for greater territorial reach, it came at a significant cost, a marked reduction in the striking power of the panzer divisions. The very core of the German military's offensive capability was weakened, potentially undermining the effectiveness of the entire campaign in the east. Despite the challenges posed by reconstructing the Wehrmacht, there was a silver lining. Many of the now decidedly obsolete Panzer Is and IIs were being phased out and replaced with more modern armored vehicles. Amongst these replacements were the Czech-built PZ-35T and PZ-38T, along with the more robust Panzer IV and Panzer III models. Notably, about 700 of these newly introduced Panzer IIIs were the Ausführung F variant, equipped with significantly improved 5cm guns. This weapon boasted superior armor penetration capabilities, making it effective against the lighter Soviet tanks that the Heer would encounter in the east. To get into more gritty details, the 5cm KWK-38 was a close cousin of the PaK-37 wheeled anti-tank gun that was also being introduced into service around this time. Unfortunately, neither of these weapons proved to be much of a match for the best Soviet armor that would be encountered in the coming campaign. Eventually, they would be replaced by the 5cm KWK-39 with a longer barrel. But even this proved inadequate. At that point, the Panzer III would reach its maximum deployment capacity, and the Panzer IV would take over the anti-tank role, eventually being fitted with a 7.5cm KWK-40. This upgrade was an essential enhancement compared to the older tank models, which were increasingly outmatched on the battlefield. However, this mix of tank models became such a goddamn logistical headache that it would plague the German war effort in the East. As the distances between the frontline troops and the industrial heartland of the Nazi war machine expanded, ensuring the availability of spare parts for this diverse array of armored vehicles posed significant challenges. The complexity of maintaining and supplying such a eclectic fleet of tanks would complicate operations, making the already daunting logistics of war even more arduous. Again, to kind of explain, if the Allies were stretching, let's say, 1,000 kilometers across one end of North Africa to the other, they brought the exact same parts for everything that they were using. For the Germans, you had parts for all of the different models, for their variants, and these parts were not interchangeable. So you have a Panzer, let's say a Panzer II, for example, and a Panzer III, they're not using the same parts. So that means you're bringing twice the amount of parts, and also the people who are repairing these vehicles have to know how to repair a Panzer II or a Panzer III with all these different parts. Probably need more personnel. So you need trucks. You need to use fuel to move these personnel. And what does the Axis lack during World War II? Oil. Honestly, I could go on and bore you with the logistical stuff, but really, as soon as you start learning about the logistics of modern warfare, you realize the Axis were screwed from day one. I mean, take it just to what kind of fuel they were using. For example, the Americans had a very high-octane fuel for their aircraft that was far superior to anybody else's. It gave them a significant advantage. These little minute details would really mean a lot. Now, as the campaign progressed, the Wehrmacht's ability to sustain its operations would be increasingly tested, revealing the stark limitations of its overly diversified vehicle inventory during the intense and prolonged engagements in the Soviet Union. Logistics planning for Operation Barbarossa uncovered serious problems that had been minor issues during the previous campaigns in the West. While the standardization issues with the trucks we discussed earlier contributed to these logistical headaches, sheer numbers also became a critical concern. The air faced a significant shortfall in trucks as early as February of 1940, and the situation would only worsen dramatically over time. German industry was only managing to replace about half of the losses they sustained, leaving the army struggling to maintain its mobility. Adding to the complexity, requisitions from civilians and captured stocks further complicated the standardization issues. Although these measures provided a temporary reprieve, they were not sustainable for the broader problem of equipment replacement. Compounding the challenges for logistical planners in 1941 was the fact the Soviet railroads operated on a wider gauge track than the standard used throughout the rest of Europe. Yeah, what could seem as such a minor detail, the gauge of a track, would be a profound thing during World War II. As you can imagine, the most powerful land-based logistical method, honestly even to this very day, is by rail. The Germans depended heavily on rail for transportation, and honestly, upon the horse and mule. The Soviet rail gauge in 1941 was defined as 1,524 millimeters between the rails. In 1970, the Soviet gauge was standardized to 1,520 millimeters. European rail gauges at this time was about 1,435 millimeters. This is known as a standard gauge. Most, if not all, the continental tracks were set to this size before the turn of the century. The notable exception was the Iberian Peninsula, which ran a 1,672 millimeter in Spain and a 1,664 millimeter in Portugal. This discrepancy became a formidable obstacle in transporting supplies and reinforcements to the front lines. I have no idea why it wasn't standardized. This is actually very strange. Why would you not standardize rail gauges? You would assume Europe would want to interconnect itself. Anyways, there was essentially two possible solutions to this problem. The Germans could either capture substantial amounts of Soviet rolling stock and locomotives, or relay the railroad tracks to conform to narrow European standard. The first option hinged on operational luck, a variable steeped in uncertainty and unpredictability, particularly in the chaos of war. The second solution would demand vast amounts of manpower and time, resources that were already stretched thin due to the expansive nature of the conflict. As logistical planners looked towards the challenges ahead, they faced a very daunting reality. Without effective and responsive logistics, the Wehrmacht's operational success in the East could be severely compromised. Now, the actual plans and troop dispositions for the invasion of the Soviet Union went through three major phases of planning. The first phase was an operational study conducted by Major General Marx. Marx was the Chief of Staff of the 18th Army. He was selected for his first draft because he was a longtime friend of Halder, and he had a reputation for being a competent mind. Additionally, Halder had already asked him to start sketching out a draft. His planning received official sanctions on July the 29th of 1940, well before Adolf Hitler issued War Directive 21. Mach's initial plan called for the establishment of two army groups, one positioned north of the Pripyat marshes and the other to the south. The Northern Army Group was designed to be the dominant force and the main effort of the campaign. In his assessments, Mach estimated the strength of the Red Army on its western front at about 96 infantry divisions, 23 cavalry divisions, and 28 motorized brigades. Interestingly, it seems that Mach was not fully aware of the existence of the Soviet tank divisions or their mechanized corps, which would later prove significant in the conflict. To counter the estimated strength of the Red Army, Mach utilized figures that included the planned continued expansion of the Heer, ultimately assigning a total of 147 divisions for the operation. This formidable force consisted of 110 infantry divisions, 1 cavalry division, 24 panzer divisions, and 12 motorized infantry divisions. The breakdown of troop allocations was as follows. The Northern Army Group would receive 50 infantry divisions, 1 cavalry division, 2 motorized divisions, and 15 panzer divisions. Meanwhile, the Southern Army Group would be allocated 5 panzer divisions, 6 motorized divisions, and 24 infantry divisions. The remaining divisions were earmarked to form a substantial operation reserve, intended to plug any gaps that might arise as the army groups advanced into the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. This early planning phase was critical in setting the stage for what would become one of the largest military operations in history, reflecting both strategic ambitions and the challenges ahead. The source material is actually a little bit unclear on exactly how the Wehrmacht thought the Soviet tank arm was fielded in the army. A fair guess might be that they understood the Red Army to be organized along the French model, which had tanks, brigades, and regiments attached to rifle divisions and corps. But ultimately, this was a significant sign that there was kind of a poor state for the Wehrmacht's intelligence at this time. Mach divided his operational concept for the invasion into 4 distinct phases. Phase 1 focused on the army groups pushing the Red Army back approximately 400 kilometers, with the objective of encircling the bulk of the Soviet forces. This initial push was essential to secure a quick victory, as failing to achieve this would lead to significant complications. Phase 2 would involve a renewed attempt to break through any new defensive lines established by the Soviets, aiming to encircle the defenders over a distance of 100 to 200 kilometers. Mach projected that these first 2 phases should be completed within a span of 7 weeks. However, he recognized the risks. If the initial operations failed, the outcome could devolve into positional warfare, where secure lines of communication would be jeopardized. Units of the Red Army that could not be decisively surrounded and defeated would eventually drain the strength of the invasion force. Scattered Soviet troops could pose threats to supply lines, demanding the attention of larger Wehrmacht units to eliminate these threats. Phase 3 of the operations called for simultaneous advances through eastern Ukraine, along with strategic captures of both Moscow and Leningrad. This was an ambitious vision, and Mach emphasized that it was heavily contingent on the success of the first 2 phases, along with robust logistical framework to support the campaign. Finally, Phase 4 was even more audacious, envisioning a broad push toward Arkhangelsk in the north and Rostov in the south, with Gorky marking the easternmost limit of the advance. This expansive objective reflected not only the ambitious nature of the plan, but also the extensive logistical challenges the Wehrmacht would face in executing such a sweeping campaign. At this stage, the strength of the Heer's logistics would be measured by the number and condition of their trucks, as well as progress made in the conversion of the Soviet rail gauge. Mach also developed a geostrategic analysis of Germany's position following an invasion of the Soviet Union. He cautioned that an immediate alliance between the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union would be unavoidable, which would likely lead to increased economic aid from the United States, a nation already heavily committed to supporting the British. Mach was astute enough to recognize that the Western Allies would seize any opportunity to land in Europe and begin efforts to liberate their fallen allies. He stressed that Germany would struggle to conduct a war on 2 fronts effectively. To mitigate this impending crisis, Mach emphasized the necessity for the Wehrmacht to defeat the Soviet Union swiftly. While he acknowledged that such a rapid victory could not be guaranteed, he firmly believed that capturing Moscow was a crucial objective to achieve this goal. In this regard, he echoed the sentiments of his friend General Halder, who was at the moment attempting to persuade Hitler to pursue this very course of action. The operational plan Mach proposed represented an incredibly ambitious undertaking, and all within a 17-week timeline. Yet it was not the most audacious plan devised by the Wehrmacht for the invasion of the Soviet Union. That dubious honor would belong to the subsequent plan prepared by Lieutenant Colonel Lausberg. On September the 19th of 1940, Colonel Walter Wehrmacht's National Defense Division of the OKW presented its proposal for a new campaign prepared by Lieutenant Colonel Bernard von Lausberg. This plan became known as the Lausberg Study, and it outlined 4 objectives for the Eastern Campaign. To destroy the enemy forces in West Russia, number 1, they had to prevent capable enemy units from retreating into the interior. Number 2, they had to isolate Western Russia from the sea. And number 3, they had to seize crucial Russian resource areas. Lausberg's plan called for 3 army groups, north, center, and south. It aimed for a primary advance on Moscow via Smolensk, while also allowing for part of Army Group Center to divert northwards to assist Army Group North. Additionally, the plan also had an advance by German and Finnish forces going through Karelia. Amongst all of the German studies, Lausberg's was unique in addressing the deficiencies of the Russian road and rail network. He asserted, all German operations must be supported in their latter stages by reliable Russian railways, as a transport system solely based on roads will be insufficient in the vast expanses. There were 2 main ways to meet this requirement, according to Lausberg. Number 1, by seizing enough enemy rolling stock and locomotives to utilize existing tracks, and number 2, by converting Russian tracks to European standard gauges. Both approaches presented significant challenges. One solution was to leverage naval power. If the Wehrmacht could swiftly capture and repair eastern Baltic ports and eliminate the Soviet Baltic Fleet, most logistical needs for the AGN could be fulfilled by sea, allowing engines and rolling stock to support the other 2 army groups. In the campaign's second phase, supplies transported by sea could sustain advances towards Volga, Gorky, and Archangel. This incorporation of sea supply in the OKW plan was a significant development, marking the first time planners considered the impact of naval power in the campaign. Historically, the German High Command had displayed a marked ignorance of maritime strategy, a failing more evident now than ever. At this point, the Navy was unaware of the impending invasion, and the OKM staff had not participated in any of the planning process. The OKH studies conducted thus far appeared as if created by individuals who believed the world ended at the shoreline. The Lausberg study changed this perspective. Lausberg conducted his study concurrently with Major General Mach's planning, but unlike Mach, who was operating under the aegis of General Halder, the Chief of Staff for the OKH, Lausberg was working under General Jodl, the Chief of Staff for the OKW. The OKW and the OKH were engaged in a very serious bit of rivalry for influence within the Nazi regime at this point, and the OKH was losing ground. One area where their influence would hold strong, though, was operations in the East. Nevertheless, the OKW still commissioned their own study of potential operations. While Lausberg's plan bore similarities to Mach's, it featured 3 notable differences. First, Lausberg divided the field army into 3 army groups rather than 2, a change that would prove to be a significant and enduring within the context of the invasion strategy. Unfortunately, an exact order of battle for his plan is rather elusive, and it remains unclear whether Lausberg even formalized one. Halder was still fundamentally in charge of crafting operational plans and leveraged the full extent of his historical responsibilities to authorize Mach's study, lending it considerable weight. In contrast, Jodl, despite being nominally superior within the OKW, lacked the gravitas associated with Halder's position. His role was much less clearly defined, and while this sometimes allowed him to seize powers in areas beyond the army's purview, it would also kind of be a hindrance. In this instance, it proved to be more of a disadvantage for him. Lausberg faced significant limitations in developing a comprehensive operational plan due to lack of resources and staff at his disposal, a direct result of his boss, that being Jodl, who did not have much of those resources. Consequently, Lausberg's plan was much more detailed compared to Mach's extensive study, despite having a lack of resources. His primary mission was not to devise the operational blueprint for the Heer, but rather to keep Jodl informed of potential strategies and scenarios that could emerge. Jodl needed ammunition in his power struggle with Halder, and Lausberg's insights were to provide that. The ultimate aim of the struggle was to influence the outcome of the planning process, and in that respect, Lausberg's contributions did a notable impact. The 3-army group disposition in his plan is a clear reflection of this influence. The second key difference in Lausberg's approach was his evaluation of the logistical situation. He recognized that without capturing a significant amount of Soviet gauge rolling stock, the strain on the existing truck resources would be insurmountable. He proposed that much of the supply possibly be funneled through captured ports in the Baltic and Black Sea, a strategy that would eventually be integrated into the final invasion plans. The third major distinction between Lossbuch's study and that of Mach's was his identification of potential support amongst the local populace in the Soviet Union. He noted that the Baltic states were still in the process of being incorporated into the USSR, and that Stalin faced considerable opposition, although mostly unarmed. Ukraine was also recognized as a possible source of support against the Soviets. However, while these ideas presented intriguing possibilities, they overlooked the racial ideology that underpinned the entire Nazi state. The Nazi regime was engaged in an aggressive war of conquest, not one of liberation. The encouragement of local independence was fundamentally at odds with the Nazis' genocidal ambitions and their desire for cultural dominance over all the non-German people. We will delve deeper into these themes in just a bit, but first we should probably talk about the final iteration of the plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The final plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union was organized and supervised by Lieutenant General Paulus. Paulus would go on to become infamous for his command of the Sixth Army at a little place called Stalingrad. At this point, however, he was a well-respected staff officer who had worked for Guderian and Lutz. At this point, he had been made the Quartermaster General of the Army, the same position that Erich von Ludendorff had held when he was military dictator, in all but name, by the way, during the later part of the First World War. The position did not carry the same power in Paulus's time, but was still one of real prestige and influence. Operating under a mandate for Halder, Paulus was tasked with refining the work done up to that point, and he approached this through comprehensive war games. He initiated these exercises in December, benefiting from Hitler's clarified political directives and updated intelligence and force estimations provided by the OKH. Paulus's studies centered around the concept of 3 army groups, mirroring the structure proposed in Lossbuch's plan. One of Paulus's most significant contributions was his insightful assessment of the Red Army's force regeneration capabilities, a factor that the previous planners had completely overlooked. While both Mach and Lossbuch had assumed the destruction of the main enemy forces, coupled with the occupation of most of their developed regions in the western parts of the Soviet Union, and believed this would render the Red Army incapable of rebuilding, Paulus was far less optimistic. He estimated that the Soviets could mobilize about 30 to 40 new divisions to reinforce the main defensive lines within the first 3 months of the war. These divisions would come from newly conscripted soldiers and force transfers from other theaters of conflict. Furthermore, he projected that this number could rise to a total of 100 new divisions within 6 months of the invasion's commencement. This potential for rapid expansion was unprecedented and would have been quite difficult for the Nazi leadership to fully comprehend. In military history, there had never been such an instance, and such a quick mobilization of forces. The idea that the Soviet Union could muster 30 to 40 new divisions in such a short time frame challenged many of the Nazi leaders' beliefs and assumptions, running counter to their entire ideological framework. Yet, as we will see, the reality was even more striking. The Red Army not only met these expectations, but actually exceeded them. Their resilience would prove to be a significant factor in the unfolding conflict. In addition to this critical insight, Paulus's wargaming also revealed another key lesson. Neither the flanking army groups, the North or South, were sufficient or strong enough to accomplish their respective objectives. This shortfall led to a significant bulge at the front, with Army Group Center advancing much further than its northern and southern counterparts, leaving its flanks exposed. To address this vulnerability, the 2 weaker groups would need to request panzer support. This support was essential as Army Group Center would struggle to adequately cover its flanks, decisively crush its encircled enemies, and support its own front. The resulting weakening of the center ultimately led to a grinding halt for the advance on Moscow, providing the Soviets with the time and space needed to organize a more effective resistance. Paulus concluded that the advance through the center had to be the primary effort, regardless of other objectives, and that Moscow should be the singular target for all 3 army groups. This conclusion may have seemed the only reasonable one, or perhaps Paulus recognized that Halder would be unwilling to accept an alternative strategy. At this time, Halder was deeply entrenched in his own struggle for influence with Hitler. He was desperate to persuade the Führer of the Moscow above all else framing of the campaign. It remains unclear whether Halder generally believed this was the best path to victory, or that it was him merely trying to demonstrate his strategic competency to the Führer. Finally, with a small note, is the profound impact of the Nazis' plans for genocide on the operational considerations for the invasion of the Soviet Union. These plans were fundamental to the entire Nazi conception of the war and its purpose. The regime believed that only through war could Germany achieve its goal of acquiring land, ominously termed living space, die Lebensraum. To secure this living space, it was essential to clear the region of those they deemed racially inferior, which meant nothing short of genocide and ethnic cleansing, on a scale that dwarfed anything else seen in human history. This was enshrined in the General Plan East, which had roots in Hitler's earliest ideas about expansion. On an operational level, the Nazis committed significant resources to execute this horrifying plan. The Einsatzgruppen formations were prioritized within the Heer's logistical plans. The Einsatzgruppen, or Special Task Forces, were the death squads of the SS. They were tasked with roving the areas in the wake of the Wehrmacht. They especially targeted Jews as part of the final solution, but they were not hesitant to murder just about anybody else. The Einsatzgruppen would number around 3,000 men initially. They were allocated special privileges for transportation and supplies. Efforts were made throughout the campaign to accommodate the Einsatzgruppen in their murderous mission. These units would follow the frontline troops, systematically carrying out mass murders throughout the Soviet Union. It should be strongly noted that they operated within the cooperation of many regular Wehrmacht personnel, and at times received active assistance, so that old myth of the clean Wehrmacht is very untrue. No one was to escape this war unscathed, physically, morally, or otherwise. This brutal strategy not only shaped the course of the invasion, but it also left an undeniable mark on the psyche of those involved, transforming the war into a harrowing chapter of human history. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. And hey, if you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. In June of 1941, Hitler planned to launch Operation Barbarossa, a bold invasion of the Soviet Union aiming to destroy its military before fully conquering Britain. Despite initial planning, the Wehrmacht faced critical logistical issues and ignored warnings about Soviet defenses. Strategic disagreements arose between Hitler and his generals regarding objectives, with General Halder advocating for the capture of Moscow first. Would the whole rotten structure cave in when they simply kicked down the door, or was Hitler about to engage in his greatest rivalry yet?